Good morning, everyone. My talk is going to be a bit more austere. In 2007, while visiting the Venice Art Biennale, I came across a simple piece of an erased blank magazine by an Australian artist whose name is Christian Capurro. He enlisted 260 people between the years 1999 and 2004 to erase every image from a 246-page Vogue Homme magazine. Keeping track of the amount of time each person spent erasing, Capurro calculated that a total of 267 hours, 49 minutes, and 5 seconds went into the final product, wiping out all the high-end commodification from the pages of Vogue. Labor was then equated with time in order to be equated with money, the facilitator of all commodification. This was valued at 11,000 Australian dollars, although no one was paid. Ever since then, I keep thinking, A, how did they manage to not tear the pages while erasing for that long? And B, what does an erased white page really mean? On A, I'm stumped. On B, I end up not focusing so much on the erased aspect, but more on the white aspect. White is more than just a color. It is a color phenomena, which has long served as a subject of symbolism in religion, metaphysical thinking, and literature, as well as in scientific research and philosophical inquiry. But when did white become a radical form of expression in the visual arts? Let's go back in modern history to find out. In the interest of full disclosure, I add a bit of political, philosophical, and commercial references in this survey. So let's begin. In 1918, Russian artist Casimir Malevich painted White on White, which is an abstract work of art that depicts a white square on a white canvas. Malevich painted this a year following the October Russian Revolution. The image was part of the White on White series that Malevich began to paint in 1916. White on White depicts the off-white square positioned at a slight angle that has been placed onto a white background that appears to be warmer and more dense in color. What Malevich has been able to do is to present two white squares in completely different ways. What is uniquely clever is that the second square has not been painted at all, but is simply the square canvas, so he is exploring white also as a material and not just as a color. Another seminal year for white is 1951. It was the year that Betty Graham, a typist from Texas, developed a white paint solution in her kitchen to erase, or more accurately, cover up any mistakes she made as she typed. She called her paint Mistake Out, and by 1956, founded the Mistake Out Company. Not too long after, she was apparently fired from her typist job because she made a mistake that she forgot to correct. She typed her company name instead of the name of the bank that she worked for. Being unemployed, she was working to market her product from her suburban home for many years. And she changed the name of the company to Liquid Paper Corporation, which she then sold to Gillette in 1979 for almost $50 million. She died 6 months later, and her son, Mike Nesmith, from the Monkees, was primary heir to her estate. Also in 1951, Ludwig Wittgenstein was dying, and he spent his final months obsessing over the opacity of whiteness. White is opacity par excellence. The more it moves towards transparency, the less white it becomes. Robert Rauschenberg started his white paintings in 1951. These empty white canvases would become icons in the history of monochrome painting, famously prompting his collaborator and friend, John Cage, to compose in the following year, in 1952, his most important musical score, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. By 1953, Rauschenberg became disillusioned with white paintings and decided that what he really needed to do in order to free his art from the shackles of imagery was to destroy something great, something that existed independently of himself. So he famously persuaded William de Kooning to give him a drawing that Rauschenberg then erased, which took him 1 month and 40 erasers. The result, Tingwerk was a race de Kooning drawing, which was famously referred to by Jasper Johns as additive subtraction. As within the medieval pamphlet, the thing erased lingers, even if it has no physical presence. At which point, I realized that Kapura was not so original after all. In 1963, the Shah announced his White Revolution, a program that included land reform, the sale of state-owned enterprises to the private sector, a profit-sharing plan for industrial workers, and efforts to eradicate illiteracy in rural areas. The White Revolution also granted Iranian women the right to vote, increased women's minimum legal marriage age to 18, and improved women's legal rights in divorce and child custody matters. These reforms were opposed by some of the clergy, in particular Ayatollah Khomeini. He led the June 5th, 1963 uprising, opposing the Shah and the White Revolution, which eventually led to his exile to Iraq in 1964. In 1967, Susan Sontag grappled with the concept of emptiness and fullness in her essay, The Aesthetics of Silence. She said, "There's no such thing as empty space. As long as a human eye is looking, there's always something to see. To look at something which is empty is still to be looking, still to be seeing something, if only the ghosts of one's expectations. In order to perceive fullness, one must retain an acute sense of emptiness, which marks it off. Conversely, in order to perceive emptiness, one must apprehend other zones of the world as full." 1 year later, in 1968, the Soviet Union and 4 Warsaw Pact countries invaded Prague. The nonviolent civilian resistance campaign apparently included painting over all the street signs in white, except those indicating the way back to Moscow. They also shut water supplies. Needless to say, 500,000 troops were lost. The silent mass effacement spoke loudly and clearly. Then, in 1978, Hiroshi Sugimoto started working on his theater series. By shooting a whole film in a single frame, i.e., keeping the shutter of his camera open throughout the duration of the film, he produced a pure white screen, which was the sum of all images, or more simply put, everything amounting to nothing. In 1990, Mohammad Kazim began to create a visual representation of intangible phenomena, such as sound and light, using a technique that he calls scratching, vigorously scratching the surface of a piece of paper with scissors, and named it the scratching series. He uses this technique to describe the sounds in an abstract visual language, where lines and dots punctuate his work. White has become an integral part of artistic practice, either in its pure form or as part of a broader frame of reference. On the negative side, however, the radical and exclusive use of the color white has often been the subject of ridicule and a populist weapon against non-objective art. So what does this all mean? What we have seen is that whiteness can be a destruction that clears the ground for something new. If you erase one image, you are making another image. And to make any image in the first place is already an act of erasure. Deleuze argues it is a mistake to think that the painter works on a white surface. It is not a white surface because it is cluttered with potential images. In other words, a painting is the sum of its destructions, as Picasso would say. Erasure is never making things disappear. There is always an aftermath, a bruising to the surface to make it look new again. Whiteness obliterates, but is perfectly receptive. Betty's invention depended on this conundrum, and Wittgenstein's remarks failed to resolve it. By staying as far away from its supreme opacity, whiteness goes on to hold all possible images within itself. I would like to think of white as an event, a happening, a celebration of the perception of the color and color material. White may be irritating at times, because sometimes we cannot identify anything. We do not see anything, because it is white, all white, and yet it opens our eyes, tickles our senses, lets us be. White hints at a whole range of possibilities without expressing them, yet puts us on the alert. White triggers our emotions, our fears, yet is so familiar to us. White we fear, white we embrace. Can we let go of our preconceptions? I guess this explains why I'm wearing far more white these days. Thank you.